Good morning, everybody. We need to have all of our Republican members here before we vote, but we do have a chance that we have quorum that we can start, so we'll give our opening statements. And if Senator Whitehouse doesn't mind, as soon as we get to the point where we can vote, we'll go ahead and suspend and vote, and then we can move forward. I know a lot of people have a lot of different committee meetings today. So after the vote, we will be talking about, we will have a hearing on the Superfund, which we're looking forward to. So I want to thank my colleagues for attending the business meeting here to vote on the nominations of Brigadier General Brian Nesvik to be Director of Fish and Wildlife, and Jess Kramer and Sean Donahue to be Assistant Administrators at the EPA. General Nesvik has served for more than 29 years with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, retiring from the agency after serving his last 5 years as the director. Simultaneously with his service in Wyoming Game and Fish, General Nesvik had 35 years of decorated military service in the Wyoming Army Guard. His final 3.5 years was as commander of the Wyoming Army National Guard. I would note he did both of these jobs at the same time. With almost 3 decades of relevant experience and extensive leadership, he will make a great Fish and Wildlife director. Jess Kramer began working in environmental enforcement roles at the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources and the Wisconsin Department of Justice. From there, she joined the first Trump administration EPA's Office of Water, rising to the Senior Policy Council. She then joined my staff to help us negotiate the water division of the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, and she did a great job. She then went into private practice, advocating on behalf of water systems to ensure continued infrastructure investments and smart and achievable regulation. Before joining the Trump administration in January as a senior advisor, she most recently was the Deputy Secretary for Regulatory Programs at the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. With 13 years of experience advocating for clean water at both the state and federal level, as well as the private sector, Jess is exceptionally qualified to now lead the EPA's Office of Water. Sean Donahue began his career in the field of finance, but pivoted to environmental issues in 2018 when he joined the EPA. In 2.5 years at the EPA, he worked in both the Executive Secretariat and the Office of Land Emergency Management, gaining insights into the broad range of issues before the agency. After leaving the EPA in 2021, he practiced law in New York, working first in a private firm and then at a solar farm. He rejoined EPA in January, first serving in the Office of General Counsel and then now as a senior advisor to the administrator. Through both his prior service at the EPA and his private sector legal experience, his qualifications lead him to the Office of General Counsel. At their recent nomination hearing, we heard the passion that each nominee had for pursuing these positions and the experiences that have shaped their unique qualifications for these roles. Importantly, each nominee pledged to faithfully follow the laws that Congress has enacted as they carry out their duties. Based on their testimonies, I'm confident that these nominees will focus their efforts to bringing their respective agencies back to achieving their core missions and away from pushing extreme regulations that threaten the reliability of our grid and American competitiveness. I urge my colleagues to support these nominations, and with that, I will turn to the ranking member. It appears as though, we're all here. Do you mind if we move on, or do you want to give a few minutes? First. Okay. The ranking member is going to give his opening statement.
And then we'll go to the vote.
And then we'll go to the vote.
The chairman told me this morning that she is determined to be in a good mood today, so I'll start off with some good news, which is that I intend to vote in favor of Ms. Kramer. On paper and in her hearing, she demonstrated that she's qualified for the role to which she's been nominated and has a clear understanding of the Clean Water Act and other relevant laws and regulations. She seems willing to faithfully execute the duties required of the head of EPA's Office of Water, and therefore I plan to vote in favor of her nomination. Concerning Mr. Nesvik, I will vote no. I liked him, and I'm impressed by his military service, excuse me, but his clear prioritization of agricultural and fossil fuel interests over fish and wildlife protection is, in my view, contrary to the very purpose of the Fish and Wildlife Service. As to Sean Donahue, as General Counsel of EPA, he may be the most unfit nominee ever for the role of any federal agency's general counsel. He would have trouble getting an entry-level legal position in any of our offices. Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2 of the Constitution provides the Senate with advice and consent power. This constitutional power should carry some meaning. Advice and consent should not be empty words. There is no colorable argument that Mr. Donohue should survive any advice and consent process based on his qualifications. The EPA General Counsel is the chief legal advisor to EPA and provides legal advice on environmental laws, including the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, and Superfund Act, among others. Mr. Donohue has no apparent experience with any of them. He's never tried a case to verdict, never taken a deposition, never signed a pleading, and never argued a motion. At best, maybe he has supervised 2 to 3 attorneys. He practiced law for a year and a half as a junior associate at a law firm before being fired. By comparison, here are the previous 7 Senate-confirmed EPA general counsels across Republican and Democratic administrations. Jeffrey Prito, 2 decades in federal service, including as a general counsel before joining EPA. Matthew Leopold from President Trump's first term, 14 years as an environmental lawyer and state agency general counsel. Avi Garbo, 21 years practicing environmental law in the public and private sectors. Scott Fulton, various leadership roles over 22 years at EPA, which followed 8 years at DOJ's Environment and Natural Resources Division. Roger Martella, law clerk for a court of appeals, 7 years with the Natural Resources section of DOJ, and time spent as acting EPA general counsel. Ann Klee, law firm for 9 years, chief counsel for this committee for 5 years, senior counselor to the Secretary of the Interior. Roger Fabricant, 2 years in private practice, 5 years as counsel and chief counsel to then New Jersey Governor Christie Todd Whitman. Mr. Donohue, 1.5 years in general law in upstate New York, then fired, now expected to oversee 200 lawyers and 300 total staff in the Office of General Counsel. He can't even keep track. In response to QFRs, Mr. Donohue stated that he would faithfully implement the law, but in the same breath stated explicitly that the administration's current grant freeze was legal despite 2 federal court orders to the contrary. So what law does he think he will be implementing? Why is he here? Mr. Donohue's significant other is the Deputy Director of Presidential Personnel for the White House, a role that Mr. Donohue confirmed had purview over his appointment. So I will vote no, despite the fact that his manifest incompetence will probably work to our advantage.
Well, thank you, Ranking Member Whitehouse. How do you really feel about that?
I think this is an astonishing low point for us. I just have to say that.
All right. At this time, I will ask senators to hold their remarks on the nominees until after the roll call votes. I will now call up presidential nomination 2511, Sean Donohue of Florida, to be Assistant Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. I move to approve and report the nomination favorably. Is there a second? Second. Thank you very much. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Houston? Yes. Mr. Kelly? No. Ms. Thomas?
Aye.
Mr. Markey?
No by proxy.
Mr. Merkley?
Also no by proxy.
Mr. Padilla? No. Mr. Ricketts? Aye. Mr. Sanders?
No by proxy.
Mr. Schiff? No. Mr. Sullivan? Aye. Mr. Whitehouse?
No.
Mr. Wicker? Aye. Madam Chairman?
Aye.
Madam Chairman, yeas are 10 and nays are 9.
The clerk reports the yeas and nays, and with that, the nominee is favorably reported. I will now call up presidential nomination 25.28, or -28, Jessica Kramer of Wisconsin, to be an Assistant Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. I move to approve and report the nomination favorably. Is there a second? The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks?
Aye by proxy.
Ms. Blunt Rochester? Mr. Bozeman? Yes. Mr. Kramer?
Aye.
Mr. Curtis? Aye. Mr. Graham? Aye. Mr. Houston? Aye. Mr. Kelly? Aye.
No by proxy.
Mr. Merkley.
Also no by proxy.
Mr. Padilla. Aye. Mr. Ricketts. Aye. Mr. Sanders.
No by proxy.
Mr. Schiff. Aye. Mr. Sullivan. Aye. Mr. Whitehouse.
Aye.
Mr. Wicker. Madam Chairman.
Aye. The clerk will report the yeas and nays.
Madam Chairman, yeas are 15 and nays are 4.
With that, the nominee is favorably reported. I will now call up presidential nomination 25-35, Brian Nesbitt of Wyoming to be Director of United States Fish and Wildlife Service. I move to approve and report the nomination favorably. Is there a second?
Second.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsopros.
No by proxy.
Ms. Blunt Rochester. Mr. Bozeman. Yes. Mr. Kramer.
Aye.
Mr. Curtis. Aye. Mr. Graham. Aye. Mr. Houston. Aye. Mr. Kelly. No. Ms. Lummis.
Aye.
Mr. Markey.
No by proxy.
Mr. Merkley.
No by proxy.
Mr. Padilla. No. Mr. Ricketts. Aye. Mr. Sanders.
No by proxy.
Mr. Schiff. No. Mr. Sullivan. Aye. Mr. Whitehouse.
No.
Mr. Wicker. Aye. Madam Chairman.
Aye. The clerk will report the yeas and nays.
Madam Chairman, yeas are 10 and nays are 9.
Thank you. With that, the nominee is favorably reported, and I will note the presence of a quorum. I want to thank all the members for being here this morning, and I don't know if any members would like to speak on the nominees before we go into our hearing.
Madam.
Yes.
Excuse me.
Senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has, by all standards, known, and this meets the letter of the law and the intent of the Endangered Species Act, known that the grizzly bear in the greater Yellowstone area has been fully recovered and then some for 20 years. The grizzly bear numbers have met objective. The grizzly bear numbers for ratios between males and females have met numbers. The expansion of the area has occurred. The number of the diverse population necessary to sustain a population has been met. And for 20 years, we've been trying to get the grizzly bear delisted pursuant to the letter of the law of the Endangered Species Act and the intent of the Endangered Species Act. And yet the agency itself has fought it because groups, non-government groups that view the grizzly bear as charismatic megafauna that they can use to raise money for their groups is good contribution bait for them, and they won't let them off the list. It's important that when we have a win in recovering a species the way that the grizzly bear has recovered in the greater Yellowstone area, that we take the win and celebrate it. And I am hopeful that Brian Nesbitt will pursue this course of action, and I'm hopeful that as he takes the reins of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, when there are other species that we know have met, they've met objectives, they've met the rules and regs, they met the intent of the law, they've met the letter of the law, that they too can be delisted and celebrated, and we can move our attention to species that actually need it and deserve to be nurtured under the provisions of the ESA. Thanks, Madam Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate the opportunity to take just a moment to discuss my no votes on the confirmation of Mr. Nesbitt to serve as Director of the Fish and Wildlife Service. While I genuinely appreciate his candor during his confirmation hearing, and in particular his willingness to roll up his sleeves, work with me on the gritty, complex details that is California water management, and certainly to recognize his willingness to engage with a variety of stakeholders in California. I just need to cite the approaches and the action that the administration has taken, continues to take, demonstrating their hostility to the state of California, that until that changes, it's going to be hard to support nominees for these key positions. So again, appreciate the nominees' willingness to work with us, work with stakeholders, visit California, and even look at opportunities for bipartisan agreement like wildlife corridors that we've been laying the foundation on. But one individual who's not at the top of the organizational chart is going to be limited by the hostility coming from the top. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody else wish to make comments? Then I would invite our witnesses to come to the stand, please. Okay. Yeah. Okay, thank you all for being patient with us, and we are starting this hearing. I note that there are several other committees that have votes going on, one of which is one of my committees, which is Commerce. So I'm going to make my open statement and go over there quickly, and Senator Whitehouse has very kindly stepped up to the plate here to move the hearing forward. So, good morning, and I am going to be in a good mood all day, hold me to that. Today, we will discuss challenges facing the EPA Superfund Program and solutions to ensure it can live up to its full potential. Since I've become chairman, I've stressed that EPA must refocus the agency's work on the core environmental missions to deliver the cleanups and environmental solutions that most benefit the environment and America's health and welfare. The Superfund Program, as enacted, is one of the best examples of the EPA executing that core mission. Cleaning up our nation's most contaminated sites directly improves public health and can revitalize struggling communities. I've certainly seen that in my own state. Congress established Superfund in 1980 in response to several high-profile environmental disasters. The law was designed to promptly clean up heavily contaminated sites and to make the polluters responsible for the cleanup. These are important goals, but the EPA's management of the Superfund program has not delivered as intended. Communities now expect a Superfund cleanup to take more than a decade. I've already heard that from our witnesses in our informal conversations. That prolonged timeline sends a conflicting messages to communities with a site nearby. You live near one of the most hazardous places in the country, but EPA will let it sit there for years before they allow it to be fully cleaned up. Despite the lengthy cleanup timeline, the Superfund program has achieved some critical environmental and public health victories and restored thousands of contaminated sites across the country. The reason for delays that rob Superfund of its full potential is that EPA's implementation of the law prioritizes process over results. The complexity of the law has made it one of the most difficult environmental programs to administer. In practice, the main winners in managing Superfund cleanups are the lawyers who profit from endless litigation while communities wait for promised relief. To manage a law this complex, the EPA has built an entangled web of bureaucracy, work groups, task force, and committees that too often slow progress instead of delivering results. Cleaning up Superfund sites is naturally a costly endeavor, but the problems with Superfund cannot be blamed on funding alone. To better help communities get the most out of limited taxpayer funding, Congress and the EPA must identify efficiencies to accelerate the cleanups. This is particularly important when considering the overall cost of Superfund cleanups. Superfund price tag isn't just about the complexity of environmental cleanup. This is what I call the Superfund premium, a concept where the same environmental cleanup becomes more expensive and time-consuming under Superfund compared to a state-led or a voluntary cleanup program. Whether managed under Superfund authority or through a state program, remediation is likely to involve the same core work: removing contaminated soil, treating groundwater, and restoring the land. Yet, because of the Superfund premium, we often see costs just balloon and timelines stretch once a site is listed. It's not because the environmental standards are higher, but rather because the program's process has replaced the law's cleanup mission. The program's complex bureaucracy generates enormous transaction costs that have nothing to do with actual environmental cleanup. Instead of removing contaminants, limited time and financial resources are squandered on endless meetings, redundant studies, and excessive overhead costs completely unrelated to remediation. There is no shortage of responsible parties that are ready and willing to remediate this site. Even good Samaritans, well-intentioned individuals and organizations, are often deterred from cleaning up sites because of liability risks and financial barriers. Our laws should encourage, not prevent, volunteer efforts to address legacy pollution. Accelerating the pace of Superfund cleanups does not mean cutting corners or sacrificing health protections. It means defining an end goal with a clear plan that gets it to a safe, productive end state as efficiently as possible. The ensuing cleanup is driven by that goal to the benefit of communities and the environment. Right now, the priority is enforcement first, cleanup second, and leaving communities to wait far too long. That needs to change. I look forward to hearing from today's expert panel on how to improve the Superfund program's efficiency and accountability, and I now recognize Senator Whitehouse for his opening statement.
Let me start by thanking Chair Capito for this hearing and our witnesses for appearing. We're here today to talk about improving EPA's Superfund program, which is one of the best tools for holding polluters accountable for contamination at our country's most polluted sites. These sites exist in every state in our nation, and they are complex. Cleanups can be laborious and long to complete. Rhode Island has a long history with this program. Senator John Chafee, former chairman of this committee, authored the Superfund program in 1980. His son and my predecessor, Lincoln Chafee, chaired the Superfund subcommittee and championed bipartisan legislation to support the program, including authorization of the Brownfields program. I'm happy here today to continue that support and address bottlenecks in the cleanup process. However, speed must not come at the cost of efficacy. Scientists, engineers, and project managers ensure that cleanups are done right. Investigators and lawyers identify responsible parties and hold them accountable. EPA employees in these roles often have specialized experience with specific sites and communities. Institutional knowledge and relationships that once lost are hard to rebuild. Budget, staff, and speed are interrelated. As we will hear from Mr. Gomez, when annual appropriations declined from roughly $2 billion to $1.1 billion, spending on remediation fell, unsurprisingly, by roughly half. The average project completion time increased from 2.6 to 4 years, and significant delays affected 1/3 of long-term projects. When budgets are cut, work often slows down. At his confirmation hearing before this committee, Administrator Zeldin appeared before us and committed to following the law. But slashing 65% of EPA's appropriated budget and pushing out agency staff until there is no one left to execute the law violates those promises that Administrator Zeldin made, and it will do immeasurable damage to American families. He said he would defer to the professional scientists at EPA and then turned around and plans to remove EPA's independent scientific research office. Without such expertise, how do we make sure our country's most polluted sites are safe? For Superfund, this mess will delay cleanups and prolong communities' exposure to harmful pollution. Let's be clear, the winners from slashing EPA's budget and staffing and kneecapping the Superfund program are the planet's biggest polluters. They are behind this. Administrator Zeldin sat in this room and said climate change was real and must be addressed with urgency. Now he mockingly refers to the climate change religion and applauds himself for driving a dagger straight into its heart. But climate change will compromise the safety of Superfund sites. According to GAO, 60% of EPA's Superfund sites are located in areas prone to flooding, storm surge, and/or wildfire. EPA has therefore been integrating climate change resilience into its Superfund efforts. We need to plan for severe storms occurring more frequently, coastal communities flooding more severely, and wildfires scorching areas they haven't before. Superfund staff look ahead at all that when conducting 5-year reviews to see what amelioration or containment efforts need adjusting. To be good stewards of taxpayer dollars, we must ensure that climate risk remains part of the Superfund site evaluation process. Otherwise, severe weather events will wreak havoc on sites that were previously considered safe. There are changes that can be made to improve the Superfund program, and I'm glad we are here today to discuss them. However, if the Trump-Musk administration slash and burn approach continues, it won't matter what improvements we propose here today. And with that, let me turn to our witnesses for their opening remarks. Our first witness is Mr. Robert Fox, senior partner at the law firm Manco, Gold, Katcher & Fox. He is a national Superfund expert known for litigating high-profile cases like Gowanus Canal and advising on CERCLA compliance, liability, and brownfields redevelopment. Mr. Fox has previously testified before this committee on the Superfund program, so welcome back to the committee, Mr. Fox, and I recognize you for your opening statement. You have 5 minutes, and your full statement will be made a matter of record.
Thank you. Chairman Capito, Ranking Member White House, and members of the Environment and Public Works Committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. My name is Robert Fox. After graduating from Harvard Law School, I have practiced environmental law for 40 years. I have taught Superfund as an adjunct professor for 27 years at Penn Cary Law School. My clients on Superfund matters range across all industry sectors and municipalities, including the City of New York. My testimony identifies common sense approaches to achieve Superfund's primary goals. For the past 45 years, courts in Superfund's legislative history make clear that Superfund has two primary goals. First, incentivizing the prompt voluntary cleanup of the nation's most contaminated sites, and second, ensuring that polluters pay for those cleanups. Undoubtedly, there have been significant accomplishments under Superfund. It is equally clear that the Superfund program has strayed from meeting those goals. However, solutions exist within Superfund's existing statutory language, its existing policies, and with minor regulatory adjustments to realign Superfund with its primary goals. First, let's start with promptness. Superfund cleanups take too long, and that increases costs. I am aware of Superfund sites listed on the National Priorities List in the early 2000s with no remedy selected to date. I'm also aware of Superfund sites where private parties submitted remedial investigation reports to EPA and did not receive comments for years and years. Here is a proposed solution. EPA requires that private parties adhere to strict deadlines for submitting required cleanup reports with penalties for noncompliance. Yet EPA has no time frame for its own report reviews. Many states administered cleanup programs that for years experienced similar cleanup delays, but then adopted mandatory agency review times. That cleared the backlog. EPA should adopt a policy to do the same. Second, incentivizing private parties to perform the cleanup and making the polluter pay are two sides of the same coin. To create proper incentives for private parties to perform cleanups, their share of cleanup costs must be fair. Otherwise, you don't get polluter pays, you get polluter overpays. EPA has relied upon joint and several liability under Superfund to require the same deep-pocketed parties at site after site to pay for 100% of the cleanup costs, leaving those parties to pursue tens and often hundreds of other responsible parties through costly and time-consuming litigation. That approach is both unfair and inefficient and dissuades private parties from coming forward to perform cleanups. The solutions to this problem already exist within the Superfund statute and EPA's policy. EPA just has to use them. For example, Section 122B1 of Superfund describes what is known as mixed funding for cleanups. This takes the form of either EPA pre-authorizing the Superfund to reimburse parties performing the cleanup for a portion of those costs not attributable to those parties, or EPA agreeing to perform a portion of the cleanup itself with the remainder performed by the private parties. In either case, EPA pursues other parties to recover EPA's costs. That saves tremendous transaction costs for the parties performing the cleanup. EPA acknowledges that mixed funding promotes expeditious cleanups rather than protracted litigation. Despite this clear statutory authority, the Superfund program rarely uses mixed funding. That should change. Similarly, EPA has an orphan share policy. Pursuant to this policy, EPA can settle with private parties who desire to perform the cleanup and compromise a portion of EPA's past and future costs attributable to liable parties who are either insolvent or defunct. EPA's orphan share policy expressly states that it aims to provide incentives to voluntarily perform cleanups and to keep transaction costs low. Once again, the Superfund program uses this policy too sparingly. and by the policy's own terms, EPA's compromise is limited to the lesser of 25% of the cleanup costs or the total amount of EPA's unreimbursed costs. The statute contains no such limitation on an orphan share or past cost forgiveness. One final suggestion. When private parties perform a cleanup, EPA charges those parties with EPA's oversight costs, a term not defined in the statute. Oversight costs include costs for EPA contractors, but oversight costs also include costs attributable to the time spent by EPA's personnel, with no limitation on how many people work on a matter or how many hours they spend. In other words, private parties are required to reimburse EPA for work performed by internal EPA employees on that matter. Then, on top of those direct costs, EPA also pursues reimbursement of indirect and indirect cost premium for its overhead expenses throughout the entire regional office, including rent, utilities, computers, etc. This indirect cost premium can sometimes exceed 100%. Personnel costs and a premium for overhead are not appropriately reimbursable, foster inefficiency, and create a disincentive for parties to perform a cleanup. In conclusion, a Superfund program has proven accomplishments, but going forward, the program needs these common sense solutions to ensure that the program returns to meeting its primary goals.
Our next witness is Stephen Riddell, President of Industrial Development Advantage. Mr. Riddell has extensive experience in managing successful hazardous waste cleanups, including Superfund sites. His company specializes in acquiring contaminated properties and remediating them so they can be safely redeveloped. I will now recognize Mr. Riddell for his opening statement.
Chairman Capito, Ranking Member Whitehouse, and members of the Environment and Public Works Committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Steve Riddell, and by way of background, I graduated from Allegheny College with a degree in environmental studies, and while working earned a Master in Business Administration from the University of Pittsburgh and a law degree from Duquesne University. I've worked for over 40 years in the environmental industry as an environmental consultant, a corporate environmental manager, and a founder and principal in Industrial Development Advantage, an environmental liability assumption company. IDA, Industrial Development Advantage, acquires contaminated sites and assumes the underlying liabilities, which we then resolve through remediation and redevelopment. Our transactions typically involve environmental insurance that includes pollution legal liability insurance and excess of indemnity coverage that can often be obtained by IDA for the benefit of the seller. By way of example, IDA acquired the East Chicago, Indiana Superfund site in 2022. IDA negotiated a liability assumption agreement with the participating PRPs and a prospective purchaser agreement with the EPA to finish operable unit soil remediation. Our focus at this site is on remediation, repositioning the site, and integrating development design with remediation to ensure the work is performed in a manner that is protective of human health and the environment and also promotes productive reuse of the site. East Chicago is a prime example of parties motivated to complete a transaction to accelerate the cleanup process, including the participating PRPs, EPA Region 5, and the state and local governments. I'll note that the EPA Region 5 folks worked very hard to help make this happen. There are a couple of takeaways from this example that reinforce my hope and belief that it is absolutely possible to redevelop a Superfund site quickly, efficiently, and protectively if the right motivations are in place. First, without question, the default process is a Superfund process is cumbersome and prioritizes form and process over the ultimate goal of remediating and returning a contaminated site to productive reuse. When we approach a site, we use the general approach, what is the last chapter in this story, and we work back from that. IDA and our consultants can look at any contaminated site and figure out what the likely remediation approach should be, and we look at it in the context of the end use or best development option for that property, the last chapter. There may be some data gaps to complete a conceptual site model of environmental conditions at the site, but for the most part, we can cost-effectively figure out the best remedial approach once we identify that last chapter or reuse of the site. This can be done without the need to complete a number of reports and plans that are typically required by the CERCLA process. And in short, we can take a site from a streamlined but still comprehensive remedial investigation straight to remedial action without the unnecessary time and expense of feasibility studies or alternatives evaluations that are irrelevant to the final chapter. Our focus is on completing a risk-based cleanup based on the planned development by identifying potential exposure pathways and making sure they are eliminated as part of the remediation while site while also integrating development considerations into the overall remedial design. This significantly reduces the timeline to redevelopment. Second, the basic tools needed to make the circle process more efficient are already being used widely in other parts of the environmental industry. For example, voluntary cleanup programs that encourage the cleanup and reuse of sites with prospective purchaser agreements, covenants not to sue, and appropriate institutional controls are already in place. Third, private parties like IDA can be incentivized to bid on and acquire contaminated sites for the expected costs of remediation, with assurances like the tools mentioned a moment ago to ensure that we do not inadvertently become PRPs, while at the same time holding us to our commitment to complete the remediation on schedule and on budget. And these deals also include environmental insurance, which is a motivation for PRPs as well, or can be. Fourth, implementing our approach to timely and efficient cleanups can be facilitated and accelerated by empowering more state-led circle cleanups that place incentives on more of a voluntary program risk-based approach that gets to the final chapter efficiently, and by encouraging EPA to provide comfort letters and ready-for-use determinations on the front end of cleanups subject to approved remedy implementation. We note that states already have authority to lead Superfund cleanups through cooperative agreements, but in our view or experience, few states have done so because they lack clear direction from EPA. Fifth, Superfund liens present difficult challenges for the Superfund cleanups, especially environmental liability transfer deals. These liens basically discourage innocent parties from stepping in to facilitate cleanup. EPA already has the tools to address this challenge by negotiating the release or settlement of liens in exchange for completion of an agreed-upon cleanup plan. Lien waivers do not affect EPA's ability to go after responsible parties separately, but do help clear up title for remediation and redevelopment, and that's an excellent tool that can be used. Finally, making the delisting process more efficient can help achieve the last chapter more quickly and efficiently. A prolonged delisting can delay investment and development, and presently there are only 2 times a year when parties can request a delisting, and the process is extremely burdensome, and we view this as an opportunity for reform. In summary, in my opinion, the Circle program can be improved to incentivize the cleanup and redevelopment of sites, avoiding unnecessary transaction costs and costly remediation approaches. This will allow Superfund dollars to be used on more sites, and it will significantly reduce the time frame to clean up a site and make it available for development, shortening the timeline by years. Communities with these black hole sites are significantly and negatively impacted by the prolonged lack of progress, which often has a negative ripple effect throughout the community. This is a real negative opportunity cost in these communities. A clear path to success requires a last chapter focused risk-based cleanup design to address the underlying contamination and restore sites to their post-remediation condition and use. This will speed up the time to get these sites back into productive use and reduce the transactional costs associated with the traditional Superfund process. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Riddell. And our final witness this morning is J. Alfredo Gomez, Director in the Natural Resources and Environment Team at the U.S. Government Accountability Office, GAO. Mr. Gomez leads the GAO's work on environmental protection, including hazardous waste cleanups, toxic chemicals, and agency management. Welcome. I will now recognize Mr. Gomez for your opening statement.
Chairman Capito, Ranking Member Whitehouse, and members of the committee, good morning. And thank you for the opportunity to discuss GAO's past work on the Superfund program. The Environmental Protection Agency administers the Superfund program to clean up sites contaminated by hazardous substances. Some of the nation's most seriously contaminated sites are listed on the National Priorities List. Superfund sites can include mining sites, landfills, and former manufacturing sites. And as has been noted already, cleanups of these sites are often expensive and lengthy. My statement today is based on several issued reports as well as on updated appropriations data. Specifically, my statement discusses trends in Superfund program appropriations, numbers of NPL sites and reasons for changes, and factors identified as affecting the timeliness of NPL site cleanups. Appropriations for the Superfund program have generally declined since fiscal year 1999. In 1999, the program received about $2.6 billion. In fiscal year 2024, it received $537 million. Since the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act recently reinstated some Superfund taxes, an additional $1.44 billion was also made available to the program in FY 2024. The Superfund program also received supplemental appropriations in some years. For example, in 2009, the Recovery Act provided $600 million, and the IIJA provided an additional $3.5 billion in fiscal year 2022. Regarding full-time equivalents, the Superfund program had 2,585 employees in 2023, a decrease of 274 positions over the prior 10 years. Regarding the number of NPL sites, as of March of this year, there were 1,340 active sites, 459 sites that had been deleted from the list. When we last reviewed the NPL site cleanups, we found that the number of non-federal sites added to and deleted from the NPL generally declined from 1999 through 2013. According to EPA, there are several reasons for the decline in the number of non-federal sites added to the NPL. For example, some states may have been managing the cleanup of sites with their own state programs, especially if a potentially responsible party was identified to pay for the cleanup. The decline in the number of non-federal sites deleted from the NPL was because of the decline in annual appropriations and the fact that sites remaining on the NPL were more complex and took more time and money to clean up. From our prior work, we've identified many factors that can affect EPA's ability to clean up NPL sites in a timely manner. One is that some sites are more technically complex to clean up because of site characteristics. So, for example, complicating factors at sediment sites include their large size, the location, tidal influences, multiple sources of contamination, and difficulties related to sampling and modeling at the site. Another is challenges with stakeholder involvement, which can take EPA time and resources to address. For example, stakeholders such as surrounding communities, local governments, and industry may have different opinions and competing interests, and their levels of knowledge of the Superfund program may vary. A third is decreases in agency resources can cause cleanup delays. For example, shortages in EPA regional staffing levels and a decline in state environmental agency personnel can cause delays throughout the Superfund program, from site assessments to completion of remedial action projects. In summary, EPA's Superfund program has generally faced declining annual appropriations with influxes of supplemental appropriations in some years. In addition, the Superfund taxes are now providing additional funding. Our previous work shows that the numbers of new sites added to and removed from the NPL have generally declined from fiscal year 1999 through FY 2013. And there are several factors that can affect the timeliness of NPL site cleanups. GAO has ongoing work for House Majority that is reviewing funding and expenditures of the program, as well as planned work to examine NPL site cleanup status. So Chairman Capito, Ranking Member Whitehouse, this completes my statement. I'd be pleased to respond to questions.
Thanks very much. I guess I'll begin until the chair can return. Let me start with you, Mr. Gomez. Is there any doubt in your mind that flooding of a Superfund site, whether from storm surge or riverine, riparian flooding, or a wildfire burning through a Superfund site, can create contamination issues and, if not properly managed, can interfere with the remediation process?
Certainly, there is no doubt in our past work where we looked at this question, right, of the Superfund sites and then the potential effects from flooding, wildfire, storm surge, there are many sites across the country that are located in places where these things are happening. In fact, we traveled to several sites. We visited a site in Houston, Texas, the San Jacinto River site, where because of unprecedented rainfall from Hurricane Harvey, it actually dispersed the contamination on the river. And so it's happening at sites across the country. I think the purpose of our work was to show how many sites are located in places where these things are happening, and it's important then for EPA to ensure that the remedy that's in place is going to be protective, right?
And I would argue that recent experience that you've described in Texas, also in Florida, shows that this isn't a potential, it's actually happening, and we have to be prepared. And I would add my own editorial comment that the flagrant errors in FEMA flood mapping create an additional burden for people managing Superfund sites because they have to figure out what the real flooding risk is, not what FEMA's phony baloney flooding risk is based on incompetent or inaccurate mapping. I've got a specific question because we've got a Bradford dye and finishing site on the Pawcatuck River in Rhode Island. It's an American wild and scenic river, and there is a significant risk of flooding and release of contamination there. While we're going through the process of remediation, there is significant danger of contamination out of lagoons that have been prepared to sort of as a catchment area. What are the interim measures during the period of a remediation that EPA could require for a site like this while the listing package is being prepared?
So in this case, I mean, EPA can explore other options, and it sounds like this is contaminated sediment, which really complicates, right, in terms of what the agency can do, just because of the various things that are happening in place. In other places, perhaps you could do a removal, right, where you could do a removal perhaps of the contaminants that are present as the continuing work takes place to figure out how you're going to remediate it. But really, I think in those cases, it's important for EPA to have the expertise, right, to be able to figure out what are the steps that they can take in that very site-specific place, and to make sure that it has the expertise, and if it doesn't, that it can go outside to get it.
Mr. Riddell, another site-specific question here. In the Navy property in Newport, Rhode Island, there's an abandoned hospital, which is on extremely valuable property, could be put to valuable reuse. It is within the boundaries of a Superfund site, although it appears to have itself very minor contamination. In your experience, what would be the appropriate vehicles for trying to assist with the development and reuse of that hospital, even though it is within the Superfund boundary, if it can be shown that the contamination specific to the property is minor?
In my experience, you know, if we could separate that hospital location from the overall Superfund site through some kind of segregation, modifying the parcel lots, I think that a competitive bid process for folks to come in and evaluate it would I think the market would take care of that one. I mean, my suspicion would be there's probably asbestos, ACM contamination in the building.
In the building itself, yeah.
And that could be pretty significant. So, I think an RFP for folks to come in and look, first an asbestos evaluation, and then bring folks in to look at it and kind of get a sense for who would put an investment in to take on that risk would be worthwhile, because I could see that being a motivating factor for folks to get involved and clean that up.
Waterfront property, no less.
Exactly.
Madam Chair.
EPA does have a policy called redefinition of Superfund sites, where you can go through a process and redefine the site boundaries and segregate that property.
I'm going to go to Senator Husted from Ohio, since I'm just getting back into the committee.
Thank you, Chairwoman Capito. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today. Ohio is a state that has traditionally been part of our nation's manufacturing heritage and over time has had the legacy of some of the challenges of those industrial sites. We have had 38 Superfund sites, 31 of them have been addressed, but we have some that have been pending since 1993, one that's been pending since 1993. Many of these that have been pending over 15 years or over major aquifers, which citizens in our communities get their water. And whether it be a storm or a hurricane or just the constant fact that we get rain a lot and there's drainage and there's all kinds of things that happen to these sites over time and how it can affect people's quality of life, health. What can we do to speed this up? I'm interested in learning from all of you today, what action can we take? What action can the government take? What action can states take? And I want your best thoughts on how these a state like Ohio can do a better job on cleaning up these last 7 that are hanging out there. We'll start with you, Mr. Fox.
Sure. First of all, I've worked on the Painesville Superfund site, so I'm aware of what's going on in Ohio. I really think that the Superfund remedy selection process is completely broken, and I'll tell you why. I've done work under Superfund cleanups, RECRA cleanups, state voluntary cleanups, and there's really 3 issues. It really goes to what Mr. Riddell said. It's who's exposed, meaning who are the receptors, what contaminants are they exposed to, and how do we cut off those exposure pathways? Those are the 3 things. We've gotten bogged down in making the perfect the enemy of the good. And the good is for the remedy to be protective. It's always that, to make the remedy protective. But the process is so burdensome and cumbersome and takes so long and is so costly that we don't serve the cleanup.
Is that a law or a regulator problem?
That is the way that the National Contingency Plan, which is the process for selecting the remedy, is actually implemented. It's not the law, it's the way it's being implemented. And we can't have these be a science project. We want them to be technically sound. That's everybody's goal. But you can't have a process where you don't get a remedy selected, as you said, for 20 years. And so that has to change. Also, just to give you one example of this, I mentioned I worked at the Gowanus Canal. When a remedy was selected and they looked at the cost of implementing 2 CSO tanks, they thought that the remedy for that was going to cost $77 million for the city of New York. The current estimate for that is over $2 billion. And so that has to change too. A realistic cost of what the remedy is to achieve the cleanup goals has to be incorporated into this process.
And Mr. Riddell?
Well, I think Robert hit the key points. We've talked about them in our summaries, but I would say, not knowing anything about these 7 sites, but the fact that they've been looked at and in the Superfund process for 20-plus years, my recommendation would be bring in a new team and audit all 7 and just see where they're at and how we can get to the, I'll use a football analogy now, how we can get to the end zone. There's got to be so much data on these sites that you can almost, come up with, what's the hurdles here, what are we waiting on? And I think sometimes there's issues on the community side where maybe there's hesitancy to move things forward, but the flip side of that is the community's been waiting for 20-plus years for something to happen, so that's why they're upset, and who can blame them? So I think a fresh set of eyes to look and audit these projects and hopefully could clear the way that, this isn't a 30-year project, as Rob said. There's a, let's get to the end chapter, let's get to that end zone, and let's look at it. And my inclination would be that there's so much data out there that if there is some data gaps or if there are data gaps that have to be completed, they're minor, and there's things that should be able to be done in relatively short order, just in my opinion, just because of the fact that these sites have been, ping-ponged around for 30-some years. So I think a new set of eyes would help audit that process.
So, Senator, I would say because it's at the EPA regions where the work is taking place, so that you want to make sure that for Ohio, in Region 5, that they have the people they need to do the work. So I do agree that the remedy selection process takes a long time. It takes a long time, sometimes to list sites on the NPL, but then also to get them cleaned up. But you want to make sure that you've got the staff, the regional staff who are doing the work, like the remedial project manager, for example, for each of those sites.
Thank you. Chairwoman Capito, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Back when I was first elected to the Senate, Congressman Blumenauer took me out on the the Willamette River for a 10-mile stretch, Portland Harbor Superfund site. And he said, this has been going on for 10 years. This has to be resolved before I retire. Well, he retired last January. And I've watched this with enormous frustration. Essentially, the projects involves testing the soils along this 10-mile stretch, deciding what to excavate, what to cap, and then doing those two things, and what to leave to natural erosion and natural process. So finally, 17 years after it was listed, there was a record of decision about what to do. Still, basically nothing has happened for cleanup. And it appears to me that the process is stalled, waiting for resolution about who among the potentially responsible partners will pay what, which means all kinds of lawyers being hired every which direction, all sorts of subgroups being formed to challenge the EPA's decision in court. I think it's gone now through 3 rounds of testing the river, because every 7 or 8 years, it's like, oh, well, maybe the river's changed. Maybe we need to re-examine where the contaminants are. How do we stop this eternal process of planning and actually do the dam cleanup? Do we need to dive into the cleanup after the record of decision and not wait for the potentially responsible partners to sort out who will pay for it? How do we avoid this now that we're 25 years now into this project? And I think this is emblematic of what has happened in many Superfund sites. Whoever feels like they have the best insight on how to fix this.
So, I'm involved in a lot of that litigation that you talked about, so I'll speak against interest here, but those transaction costs should never slow down the cleanup. EPA has many tools. I mentioned a couple, but they have other enforcement tools to bring the parties forward to do the work. They have to create the incentives for those parties to do it so that you can't go to the same companies, deep-pocketed companies, every time and say you have to pay 100% of the costs, and you figure out how to sue the other 100 parties and spend 10 years in litigation doing that. That is inefficient. And so I agree with you. I know the Portland Harbor site. Contaminated sediment sites are more complex than your typical site, but there are examples where they have been a remedy selected in 2 or 3 years and the work started and partially completed. And so that remedy selection process is the obstacle. It's not private parties suing. That can happen separately, completely separately from the actual remedy selection and the cleanup.
So the remedy in this case was the record of decision was made. Should the federal government be paying for the work until the potentially responsible partners sort out who pays for it?
There's many options that they have. One is they could do the work themselves and seek to recover it later. 2, they could have the private parties come forward and do that, but in order to incentivize the private parties to do that, those private parties want to know that they're not going to be in years and years of litigation to recover. And if there's 100 parties at the site and the federal government says, you 4 do it, and then spend the rest of your time going against those other 96, that is inefficient.
Okay, well, it's massively complex, and I've watched as personnel have changed in terms of trying to drive the process forward. I think there's probably several dozen very well-intentioned employees of EPA who have burned out over the process of trying to drive this forward in the context of the lawsuits and resistance and re-examining. I would like to see the work done and get on with other challenges as opposed to spending endless years and endless amounts of money planning, replanning, trying to figure this out. And if it requires major changes in how the law is designed, I want to understand those and see if we can make this process work more effectively. I am extremely concerned now about the cuts to EPA's staff and how that may reverberate in terms of people continuing to drive the process forward. My whole impression has been that the potentially responsible parties understand every strategy for delay and are intent on pursuing those because they don't want to pay out. And this is going to be $1 billion cleanup. They don't want to pay for $1 billion cleanup. And so they've been very effective at working that angle. And having EPA competent staff are essential to keep the project moving forward. I'm afraid with reductions in those staff, we may see the problem just get worse.
Thank you. I would like to, we're hearing a lot about what is driving the costs. I talked about the Superfund premium. I think from the testimony, we may not have the same name for it, but it's falling under the same umbrella of what I was talking about. Let me just kind of dig deeper on this remediation plan hold up, Mr. Fox, that you've talked about. Is it a matter of the best strategy to clean up a particular site? Is it arguing over the best way to do it? We've heard it's not really arguing over who's going to pay for it, or is that the holdup? Or is it the science has not been done, or I don't know. Point to one or two or three things in this process that we could change that would make this go faster.
So first of all, I want to say I don't think the holdup is who's responsible for it.
Okay.
That's not the holdup in my mind.
Okay.
I'm going to echo what Mr. Riddell said, and that is there are very known ways to evaluate what the risk is at the site and how to clean them up. Some sites are more complicated than others, but those general principles that I mentioned about knowing who's exposed, knowing what they're exposed to, and eliminating those pathways. I don't want to use the wrong term, but it's not rocket science.
Right.
We've been doing this for a long time. What happens is the process is so cumbersome. The reports, the back and forth on scientific stuff. It's not a science project where you have to study every molecule. Mm-hmm. You can get there much faster, get a remedy selected. And by the way, Superfund contains a fail-safe because the statute requires that every 5 years the remedy that is selected and implemented is reviewed to see whether it is protective of the environment. Mm-hmm. So let's get it done through a much more streamlined remedy selection process. That is the major holdup as I see it.
Okay. Mr. Riddell, I'm going to ask you, I'm assuming that you've done cleanups for Superfund sites and cleanups for private or state level cleanups. Okay. Right. So I want to contrast those. When you do a cleanup, say for a state or maybe for a private entity, and you don't have this cumbersome process, would you agree with Mr. Fox that some of the things that are thrown into the Superfund process? So how does that work in a different when you're doing it for the state or for a private entity? You mentioned a site in West Virginia that's a Superfund site you're getting ready to do at the McElroy mine. Is that correct?
That's not a Superfund site, but I have a better example.
Okay.
The site we closed on in 2022 in Indiana was a Superfund site. If we'd have done that cleanup under the voluntary program of Indiana versus how we did it under the Superfund program, just my consulting costs alone and to some extent my legal costs, probably 2 times more doing it on the Superfund site than if we were in doing that same work under a voluntary program. And as Rob said, I mean, it's almost like, when you have your little kid anxious to go out and play, when we have a site, we want to clean it up. We want to get started with the remedial investigation and get to the RA. And Superfund, you got to stop. You got to do your QAP. You got to do that. You get so many extra plans that you have to do. A QAP, by way of example, Quality Assurance Project Plan, where you go through basically a real thorough analysis of the laboratories that you're going to use, the laboratory you're going to use to test the groundwater, the dirt, and things. And it's it's a very detailed process. It's an expensive process. There's smart people involved. But we're using EPA-certified labs, so, on the volunteer
they're already
side,
certified,
we're already using
yeah.
an EPA-certified lab, but I have to do this extra level of detail to satisfy the Superfund requirements. That's one small example, but it just compounds. It compounds. Instead of getting focused on what are the issues, how do we deal with them, and how do we clean them up to be protective of human health and environment, and then integrated development, we're still in this process of this plan, that plan, this plan.
Right, so, I mean, it begs the question, if you're using an EPA-certified lab, why do you have to keep going back and recertifying?
Begged my questions, for sure, yeah.
Yeah. Mr. Fox, let me ask you from the folks that live in and around Superfund sites. They have great economic development promise, in my view, because they are clean. You don't have, it's much easier for a developer in some cases to come in because the work's already been done. What do you see when you go into different communities about the restlessness of why is it taking so long? Not adding the economics onto the health issues that are sometimes associated with these sites. I mean, I think what we're doing is we're stymieing communities from being able to have confidence that they can, A, redevelop or be living in a healthy community.
I agree with you 100%. I see it over and over again. Communities are frustrated because the potential exists for a win-win-win. Redevelopment of the site, protective of their human health and the environment, and the longer it goes on, they become distrustful.
Right.
They become distrustful of EPA, they become distrustful of the private parties who are doing the work, and it feeds upon itself. Speeding up the process will get this back to productive use and eliminate the exposure of these communities, and they will eliminate that distrust.
Right. Thank you. Senator Blunt-Rochester.
Thank you, Chairwoman Capito and Ranking Member Whitehouse, and thank you to the witnesses. As you can hear from the questions that are being asked, I think this is an issue that cuts across party line. It cuts across rural, urban, wherever you are. And we know that the Superfund program is vital to communities across the country. It ensures that our lands are clean. It's important for economic development issues, and it helps protect the health of Americans even after the original polluters are gone. By cleaning up these industrial pollutants, we can decrease the risk of cancer, heart disease, and respiratory illness. Mr. Gomez, your testimony and extensive research on the Superfund program highlights issues related to site complexity as a factor in delays. Can you further discuss how site complexity leads to delays and how a project may utilize funding to clean these types of sites?
Sure. So, we've also been talking about the sediment sites. I think everyone's had examples. Senator Merkley talked about one in his state. And those sediment sites, right, where the sediment is contaminated, it could be miles of contamination along a river. And so those are areas that, take a lot of work and resources for EPA to sort of figure out the contamination, where it's spreading. There are other site characteristics also that can be complicated in terms of tidal movements. And so figuring out in those cases, like where the contamination is it migrating, how to contain it, how to treat it, that requires a lot of time and resources. And those are the biggest sites. They take over a decade to work on. I think Senator Merkley talked about over 20 years in his case. And I know that in your state, there are some as well that are sediment sites. There's a lot of knowledge and information already on treating and dealing with sediment sites, even though each Superfund site is different, right? But there's a lot of knowledge and expertise already there that the agency needs to make sure that it's using as it moves forward.
Yeah, I would say, we know that this takes reliable and robust funding to really deal with the cleanup of these contaminants, and it's why the bipartisan infrastructure law was so important. Someone mentioned the IRA as well. And in Delaware, we have Standard Chlorine, a site that's known as an orphan site because the original polluter has since gone bankrupt. So again, back to how that impacts communities. This has left the site in the hands of the state and EPA to clean up and protect the community's health and safety. Mr. Gomez, the Standard Chlorine site is a complex site. What factors should be considered before a cleanup takes place? or is completed?
And so this is this is one of the orphan sites you were talking about as well?
Yes.
Yeah, right. So right, the orphan sites is an area that EPA has to figure out, if it tries to find a responsible party. Otherwise, it has to do it itself, right, and then try to recoup those funds. And that is where appropriations do come into play, right, because you want to make sure that funding is available to start new projects in that case, because EPA historically focuses appropriations on ongoing remedial action. So what we've learned from our work is in the past, EPA doesn't start new remedial actions because it doesn't have the funds to it, because it's prioritizing the funds that it has to continue the cleanup on those that are already taking place, because it's less expensive to just continue that, whereas if you stop them, you've got to remobilize all of the equipment that you're working on. So yes, for orphan sites, that is a challenge, but when there have been supplemental appropriations, the agency has been able to focus on those. You'd mentioned the Infrastructure Act that allowed EPA, in fact, I think their latest report to Congress from last year, over 100 sites were able to start remedial actions, and so they've been using those funds for that purpose.
And I know we can all speak to the health aspects of this, but could you speak specifically to it for complex site? For example, does the EPA need to consider contamination migration? Can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Sure, right. So for these sites, there's a lot of sampling that has to take place and modeling. And the sampling is sort of getting at what you're talking about, figuring out, first trying to characterize what the contaminants at the site are, if they're migrating, where they're going. The modeling aspect is, again, trying to sort of figure out the inputs from the data that you're collecting in the sampling to figure out, again, how the contaminations might migrate, but also how it might affect the risk that's there. And so those are things that take a lot of resources and take a lot of time from the agency. There's also uncertainty in the models, so that, you have to spend enough resources to make sure that the models are predictive of what might actually be taking place.
I've run out of time, so I will submit more questions for the record, but thank you so much to the witnesses, and I will also submit some questions for the other witnesses as well regarding complex sites. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Senator Schiff.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and congratulations on your former staff moving forward in the confirmation process.
Yes, thank you.
She had the best training possible, clearly. Thank you all for coming in to testify, and Mr. Fox, good to see you again. In the interest of full disclosure, we are law school classmates. Somehow you must be in a much less stressful line of work. You still have much more hair than I do. Mr. Fox, you testified about one idea to improve the timeliness of cleanup, and that was mandatory agency review times. And I guess I have a couple of related questions. One is, in the states that have adopted those kind of time periods, what is the repercussion if the agency doesn't get the work done in time? Is it an automatic approval of the remediation plan? And then related question is, if we are, it's an attractive idea that I've thought about in other contexts, but if we don't have the staffing at EPA, if we further reduce staffing at the EPA, if the reason for the delays by the agency is just there just aren't the personnel, then does that work, or does that just result in remediation plans being approved without any review? So how much of the issue of the current delays is simply lack of capacity at EPA, and does your proposal work if we don't address that?
That's a fair question. I don't think the primary issue is the lack of staffing, and I can relate Pennsylvania and New Jersey examples of deemed approvals. It is a deemed approval. So if you do not respond within specific timeframes, and there's different timeframes for different reports that's written into the regulations, then it is a deemed approval. You don't want a deemed approval, to be honest with you. The goal is not to get something approved because the agency hasn't reviewed it. The goal is to make the agency review it. And it has worked. It has speeded things up tremendously, and I would say we certainly have not overfunded our state agency in Pennsylvania. So I think that's a real issue, but I don't think that's the heart of the problem. It's the time it takes to review. It can go on for years before you get a response. That just can't happen.
We've seen that in California, where it has gone on for years and years. And if it isn't staffing, then what do you think it is that accounts for such delays?
I think it is the overly prescriptive nature of the Superfund remedial selection process, which has too many bells and whistles that are unnecessary. Steve gave one example of a QAP. There's a number of different examples. It's just overly prescriptive and unnecessary to get to a protective remedy.
And Mr. Gomez, do you have a similar or a contrary view on that?
I mean, I think there's something to be said for that. I mean, what we've learned from the work, right, that it is important to have the staffing that's there. But I think that, the Superfund program has been in place for a very long time. So I think there is an opportunity, right, especially as Congress is considering changes, to look at the process and perhaps look to see where most of the time is spent. And we have some new work that we're starting where we're going to be looking at the funding and then some planned work to just look at the overall Superfund process. So in those places, perhaps, where there are the longest times, try to figure out why and what can be done to change it.
The DOGE website announced a few weeks ago that it intends to shut down the EPA regional office in Los Angeles. Can you describe, Mr. Gomez, a bit about what those regional offices do, and what will that mean in terms of Superfund sites around LA?
Sure. So, I mean, in the Superfund program, the work takes place at the regional offices, right? So you have to, if you're going to make changes, any kind of changes, you have to keep in mind how those regional resources might be affected, right? Because those are the folks that are doing the work. So, yes, so I think we're also, in our work, waiting to see if there are going to be any proposed changes, what that may mean for how the program is carried out.
So if that office closes, then they would just have to deploy EPA personnel from farther away? Is that?
I mean, I think that's one of the comments that's out there, is that people might be given additional responsibilities, and so how that may affect their work is yet to be seen, if that takes place.
Yeah, because we, among others, you're probably familiar with the Stringfellow acid pits in Riverside County that was added to the national priority list, and apparently it has been on that list year after year after year. Appreciate your testimony and the suggestions that you've made, and thank you, Madam Chair, for holding the hearing. We'll follow up with some additional questions for the record.
Thank you. I believe Senator Kelly is on his way, so we'll wait just a few minutes, and while we wait, I wanted to ask an additional question. On the train derailment in Ohio several years ago, we had testimony in this committee about EPA's role. We also heard, again, delays in cleaning it up. And part of the problem, from my understanding, was that certain states decided, even though they had certified, probably EPA-certified toxic folks that could take the toxic material into their businesses, that's their business, that certain states said, we don't want that in our state. I believe Michigan, if I'm recalling correctly, was one of the states that said this. Have you run into this type of issue as you're remediating in either one of your, either you, Mr. Fox, or Mr. Riddell, where you've had a refusal to accept toxic materials that you're taking? I'm assuming you do this. Take it to a EPA certified site. Is this an issue?
My experience is I have not run into that. If we're going to an off-site location, in whatever state it is, that location is permitted to accept those hazardous wastes, and they have a permitted facility that's either a landfill, an incinerator, right, or whatever it might be. And so, they have the permit, you have the right DOT permits, and you have the right transporter. I have not seen an instance in my experience where anything's been denied because we're using all the proper protocol.
Right, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
What about Mr. Fox? Do you recall that?
There's two issues. One is there's a limited number of hazardous waste disposal sites, so you don't have this great selection. I suspect that a lot of that was community opposition, more.
It was.
Yeah, that was, we don't want that. The facility is properly permitted to accept it.
Right.
But the community says, I don't want that waste. You're taking it off of there and putting it into my community. I'm assuming that that was probably what was behind it.
Yeah, and then it kind of blows up into a
Political issue.
A political
as opposed
issue.
to a regulatory issue.
Yeah, I mean, I just hope, these are professionals that are going to the letter of the law to be able to dispose of this and actually creating a business model that can help you and help all these other sites. It was rather, I think, kind of shocking, not just to me, but to them, that this was going on, when these sites had been there forever, the cleanup sites. But
I mean, trust
anyway.
me, to get a RCRA permit for a hazardous waste disposal facility is a rigorous process.
Right, my understanding as well. All right, Senator Kelly.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Gomez, good morning.
Morning.
I want to ask you for your perspectives about a group of Superfund sites, the more than 500 abandoned uranium mines on the Navajo Nation. I've discussed these frequently before this committee. I want to get your perspective on how we address this issue. First off, as you may know, the Navajo Nation is spread across 3 states, actually 4 now with a little purchase in Colorado. The majority of the nation, it's in Arizona. It's about the size of West Virginia, the Navajo Nation in Arizona, but it stretches into both Utah and New Mexico, as well as, and there are abandoned mines in all 3 states, 500, more than 500 of them. And as you may also know, those 3 states are all served by different EPA regional offices. Arizona's Region 9, Utah's 8, New Mexico's Region 6. And while Region 9 is the lead office for all issues on the Navajo Nation, we've run into issues because of this split jurisdiction. For example, mines just off of tribal land are coordinated through other regional offices. And often it's other EPA regional offices in New Mexico or Utah that have relationships with hazardous waste landfills and contractors and responsible parties to carry out this mine cleanup. Mr. Gomez, are you aware of other similar instances where a group of Superfund sites stretch across EPA regions?
That's a really good question, and I'm not aware that that is the case, but we can look to see if other tribal nations, right, are sort of spanning across multiple EPA regions. But at this point, I can't recall of one, but we'll double check.
Okay, and so Congress has periodically established geographic offices at EPA to help carry out programs within a region that faces similar issues by virtue of geography, including the Great Lakes Office or the Chesapeake Bay Office. When it comes to Superfund cleanups, what role have these offices played in helping to coordinate CERCLA efforts in a more streamlined fashion?
Yeah, I'm not sure that we've done work on that, but we can look at that. So I am obviously very familiar with the Great Lakes Office, as you noted. That's a separate office as well. And we can look to see, to the extent that they've worked with the EPA Region 5, in this case, for the Midwest, to see whether they go back and forth and share information. That's a good question.
Yeah, I think my sense is that they probably do.
Okay.
Another challenge that has been faced in cleaning up the Navajo Nation mines is that the remedial actions identified for mine sites are extremely costly and it's technically challenging. In many instances, the preferred solution would require digging up hazardous waste rock and transporting it hundreds of miles to a waste repository. And this seems like a classic case of needing to find a new and different technological solution to address this kind of cleanup. So, Mr. Gomez, what tools and authorities exist within the Superfund program to help accelerate research and development efforts to find new and more efficient and more cost-effective site cleanup methods?
Sure. I mean, so currently the Office of Research and Development at EPA is the one that does a lot of that research that the Superfund program relies on, for example, on toxicity studies, on research on new technologies to make sure that the remedies are working as intended. So there are those opportunities there that are currently taking place and go back and forth. And you are right that mining sites are the sites that are very costly. So in our past work, when we've looked at the cost to remediate sites, mining sites are pretty high because of the things that you talked about in terms of having to dig it out, transporting the waste, removing it off-site, then treating it. So those are challenges for EPA.
Well, it's good that you, at EPA has research and development efforts underway to solve challenging problems like this. I'll note that a lot of the West faces very similar issues to what we're seeing on the Navajo Nation. And I think the entire region could benefit from the expertise of a geographic office, like the Great Lakes office. So that's why Senator Lummis and I introduced legislation called the Legacy Mine Cleanup Act, which would authorize an Office of Mountains, Deserts, and Plains at EPA to address issues unique to the western United States. So, Madam Chair, I know we've had a good conversation with your staff, and I hope to find a path forward for this legislation through the committee process here in coming weeks.
Take a look at it. Thanks.
Thank you.
So I think Senator Whitehouse has a final question.
If you don't mind, Chairman, thank you very much. This is for Mr. Fox. You've obviously had a lot of experience in this space, and there's a phenomenon that I think is real that I'd like you to react to, which is that when there's a focus on a particular Superfund site, and there is a particular potentially responsible party who has the deep pockets to do the necessary funding to clean up the site, and they become kind of a primary actor in that Superfund cleanup, they can have motives of their own. They can wish for control over how the remediation is done and argue, hey, I'm going to end up paying for this. I'm entitled to a voice in how it gets done. They can have a desire for control over what happens with other potentially responsible parties. And there have been cases in which the primary target, if you will, the primary funder, stalls things up to push EPA to look for a greater contribution from other responsible parties. And then they can have a third concern, which is that if they can put a fixed expenditure on their books year after year after year after year after year for this cleanup so that it just doesn't affect the bottom line particularly, then they have a sudden incentive to draw out the remediation as long as they can, both to keep the annual number under what they've internally allocated to the problem, and because, who knows, somebody might come along and throw out the whole EPA Superfund team, and now they can come in and say, hey, you know, we've got all sorts of new opportunities here to shut down our own responsibility. So it strikes me that the PRP is not necessarily the victim entirely of bureaucratic delay, but in particular circumstances can actually be a cause and protagonist in the question of delay of the cleanup of the site. And I'd be happy to have you respond to that now, and I'd also be happy to have you, write out a more thoughtful and complete answer if you would like to. But I see circumstances in which PRPs become part of the problem and not part of the solution.
So I think that's a fair question. It is a very complex question, which I probably will have to write, but I'll just give you a couple quick thoughts if you don't mind. So the first one is on the control over the remedy. I think it is correct that private parties would like to control the remedy, but understand that the way the statute is written, ultimately the decision on the remedy is always the agency's. Even if a private party is under an order to suggest what the remedy should be, the selection of the remedy is done by the agency, and the statute does not allow for pre-enforcement review of that remedy selection. So there's only a certain amount of control you can get on remedy selection. The second point you made with respect to going against other parties is undeniably correct. A central PRP is always looking to spread those costs among other parties who are liable, whether they do it through their own litigation or they encourage EPA to pursue those parties. So that's clearly a dynamic that happens at site after site. I would quibble with you a little bit on wanting to spread out the costs over time. And the reason I would quibble with that is because time, the cost expands to fill the time. The longer these go on, the costs increase, not just the transaction cost to get to the remedy selection, but the cost of the remedy increases as well. So I'm not sure that in all cases it is actually in the economic interest of the private party to say, let's string this out over time. It may be better to have a more cost-effective remedy done quickly and then try to spread those costs among other parties. But I'm happy to expound upon that in writing.
Yeah, I think on that last point, while the argument you have made may be the case in certain circumstances, I don't think it obviates the prospect that there are times in a large corporation when to put something under a cap so that you know what it's going to be forever, and you've got time value of money working in your favor because it's an out-year expense that you're moving it out to, right. When the financial logic of the PRP's role becomes one that incentivizes delays.
Yeah, I can't say that that never happens. I'm just saying it doesn't always happen that way. Yeah.
Okay, good. With no further questions, I would like to thank the witnesses and all my colleagues for participation. Senators who wish to submit written questions for the record have until 5 p.m. on Wednesday, April 23rd to do so. The witnesses' responses to those questions are due back to the committee no later than close of business Wednesday, May the 7th, and will be submitted for the record. I would like to say just in closing that I think, first of all, this has been an excellent hearing because you're all so knowledgeable on the issue, having lived it. But I think we have good bipartisan agreement here that the system is broken. We've put more money into this recently, and we want to see it result in completions of these projects as much as you do. So let's work together to try to find a solution. Hopefully we can ameliorate some of the problems that have been identified today. So thank you very much.
And I'll second that emotion.
Thank you. Thank you. This hearing's adjourned.